There exists a peculiar tragedy in the life of the ordinary person, one so common that it goes unnoticed, so pervasive that it seems natural, and so deeply embedded in the fabric of human interaction that most accept it as an unchangeable feature of existence. This tragedy is the daily erosion of dignity through 1,000 small disrespects, the gradual wearing away of self-worth through interactions where boundaries are crossed, words are dismissed, and presence is diminished. Walk through any office, any family gathering, any social space, and you will witness this silent violence. The person whose opinions are talked over, the individual whose time is consistently devalued, the soul whose very being seems to invite transgression. What separates those who command respect effortlessly from those who beg for it unsuccessfully? Why do some people enter a room and immediately establish an invisible perimeter that others dare not cross, while others find their boundaries violated before they can even articulate them? The answer, contrary to popular belief, has nothing to do with charisma, physical presence, or social status, though these may be symptoms of the underlying cause. The answer lies in something far more fundamental, something that Niccolo Machiavelli understood with crystalline clarity when he observed the princes and powers of Renaissance Italy. Respect is not given to the person you are, but to the person you refuse to be. The weak self must be destroyed before others can destroy you. This is not a metaphor or a pleasant thought exercise for self-improvement seminars. This is a cold, practical truth that operates in the world with the consistency of physical law. Every indignity you suffer, every boundary violation you endure, every moment of disrespect you absorb stems not from the malice of others, but from the continued existence of your weak self. This weak self is not some abstract psychological concept. It is a collection of specific behaviors, reactions, and patterns that signal to the world that you are available for disrespect. It is the flinch before the blow, the apology before the accusation, the retreat before the advance. Machiavelli wrote The Prince, not as a philosophical treatise, but as a practical manual for the acquisition and maintenance of power. Yet buried within his observations about statecraft lies a universal truth about human nature and respect. He noted that a prince who is too merciful will ultimately be seen as weak and will be destroyed by those he tried to spare. He observed that it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. But most crucially, he understood that power, and with it, respect, flows naturally to those who demonstrate complete command over themselves. The prince who cannot control his own impulses, who cannot master his own fears, who cannot discipline his own weaknesses, will soon find himself controlled, mastered, and disciplined by others. Part 1. The architecture of disrespect. Consider the moment when disrespect enters your life. It rarely arrives as a dramatic assault. Instead, it comes as a test, a gentle probe, an exploratory mission sent out by another person's subconscious to determine the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Someone interrupts you mid-sentence. Someone arrives 30 minutes late to a meeting with you. Someone makes a joke at your expense. Someone dismisses your idea without consideration. These are not random events or personality clashes. They are assessments. Every human being conducts these assessments constantly, unconsciously, automatically. We are all engaged in a continuous process of determining who can be pushed and who pushes back, who must be respected and who is available for transgression. Your weak self responds to these tests in predictable ways. It laughs nervously when insulted. It explains and justifies when questioned. It apologizes when no wrong has been committed. It tolerates lateness, accepts interruption, and swallows disrespect with a smile that says, "I am not important enough to defend my own dignity." Each of these responses is a signal, a message broadcast on frequencies that bypass conscious thought and speak directly to the primitive social calculations that govern human hierarchy. The message is simple. This person is safe to disrespect. The machinery of social interaction operates on principles that most people prefer not to examine too closely. We like to believe that respect is earned through kindness, competence, or moral virtue. These qualities certainly contribute to admiration and affection, but they do not automatically generate respect. History is filled with kind people who were taken advantage of, competent people who were undermined, and virtuous people who were destroyed. Respect, the kind that makes others think twice before crossing you, the kind that creates an invisible force field around your dignity, comes from something else entirely. Machiavelli observed that humans respect power above all else. Not power in the crude sense of physical force or hierarchical authority, though these are manifestations of it. He meant power in its most fundamental form, the power of self-determination, the power to act decisively, the power to define reality rather than react to it. When you observe someone who commands natural respect, what you are really seeing is someone who has established sovereignty over their own being. They do not seek permission for their existence. They do not apologize for occupying space. They do not adjust their behavior based on the approval or disapproval of others. This sovereignty is not arrogance or aggression. It is simply the visible manifestation of a self that has been purged of weakness. The weak self is constructed through years of conditioning, most of it well-intentioned. Parents teach children to be polite, which becomes an inability to say no. Teachers encourage students to respect authority, which becomes an automatic submission to anyone who claims superiority. Society rewards accommodation and punishes assertion, creating adults who have internalized the belief that their own needs, preferences, and boundaries are somehow less valid than those of others. This conditioning runs so deep that most people experience anxiety and guilt when they attempt to establish boundaries or assert themselves. The weak self whispers constantly, "Who are you to demand respect? Who are you to refuse? What if they don't like you? What if you're being unreasonable? What if you're wrong?" These whispers are the voice of your own destruction. Every time you heed them, you reinforce the patterns that invite disrespect. Every time you swallow an insult, tolerate a boundary violation, or accept treatment you know is wrong, you are not being mature, wise, or diplomatic. You are training the world to disrespect you. You are confirming that you are a person whose dignity can be violated without consequence. And humans, being opportunistic creatures governed by unconscious hierarchies, will continue to exploit this weakness until you make it impossibly painful for them to do so. The first step in destroying your weak self is recognizing its specific manifestations in your life. This requires brutal honesty and a willingness to see yourself clearly without the comforting filters of rationalization. Where do you consistently tolerate disrespect? Who are the people in your life who treat you in ways you would never tolerate from strangers? What patterns repeat themselves across different relationships and contexts? The weak self has signatures, predictable responses that it deploys whenever your dignity is threatened. One signature is the explanatory reflex. When someone questions your decision or challenges your boundary, the weak self immediately launches into justification. It explains, rationalizes, and provides evidence for why you have the right to your own choice. This seems reasonable on the surface, but it contains a fatal error. It concedes that your autonomy requires external validation. The moment you begin explaining your decision to someone who has no legitimate authority over you, you have already surrendered your sovereignty. You have signaled that your choices are subject to approval, that your boundaries are negotiable, that your dignity is conditional. Another signature is the preemptive apology. The weak self-apologizes before any wrong has been committed, often before any interaction has even begun. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm sorry if this is a bad time, but sorry, I know this might sound stupid, but each of these apologies is a small abdication of your right to exist and make demands on the world. They establish you as a supplicant, someone who must beg permission to speak, to need, to want." People unconsciously register these apologies as submissions, and submissions invite domination. The nervous laugh is another telltale sign of the weak self. When insulted or challenged, the weak self laughs, not from genuine amusement, but from anxiety and a desperate attempt to diffuse tension. This laugh signals that you are not taking the transgression seriously, that you are not prepared to enforce consequences, that you can be insulted with impunity. Observe the person who commands respect. They do not laugh when disrespected. They do not smile and change the subject. They acknowledge the transgression with a directness that makes the transgressor immediately aware that a boundary has been crossed. The weak self also manifests in the way you manage your physical presence. It makes itself small in spaces, literally and figuratively. It speaks with upward inflections that turn statements into questions. It maintains excessive eye contact out of nervousness or avoids eye contact out of fear. It mirrors the body language of others rather than establishing its own center of gravity. All of these micro-behaviors communicate uncertainty, malleability, availability for reshaping by external forces. They say, "I am not solid. I am not fixed. I can be molded to your preferences." Perhaps most damaging is the way the weak self handles time. It arrives early and waits patiently when others are late. It extends deadlines when others fail to deliver. It accepts last-minute cancellations without consequence. It allows its schedule to be constantly interrupted by others who would never tolerate such interruptions themselves. Time is the currency of life, and the person who allows their time to be consistently devalued is announcing to the world that their life itself has no value. The weak self makes your time available to everyone except yourself, creating a pattern where others learn that there is no cost to wasting it. Understanding these patterns is not enough. Knowledge without action is merely another form of weakness. The tragedy of self-awareness is that it can become yet another arena for the weak self to operate. Yes, I know I allow disrespect, but I'm working on it. I understand my boundaries aren't strong, but I'm not ready to change yet. I see how I tolerate this behavior, but they're going through a difficult time. All of these statements are the weak self's way of surviving scrutiny. By acknowledging the problem while ensuring nothing changes, Machiavelli would have recognized this immediately. He understood that in the realm of power, intentions mean nothing and explanations are irrelevant. What matters is what you do when your dignity is challenged. What matters is how you respond when someone tests your boundaries. What matters is whether you enforce consequences or simply absorb transgression. The world does not care about your internal dialogue, your growth journey, or your intentions to be stronger someday. The world only responds to demonstrated capability and the willingness to act. The destruction of the weak self begins not with affirmations or visualizations or any of the comfortable practices that allow weakness to persist under the guise of self-improvement. It begins with a simple decision. From this moment forward, disrespect will have consequences. This is not a decision to be rude, aggressive, or unnecessarily confrontational. It is a decision to enforce reality. And the reality is that your dignity is not negotiable. Your time is not free. Your boundaries are not suggestions, and violations will result in immediate and proportional responses. This decision will feel uncomfortable. It will generate anxiety. The weak self will scream in protest because it knows that this decision represents its death sentence. It will produce 1,000 reasons why now is not the right time, why this particular situation is an exception, why enforcing consequences will make things worse. It will invoke fairness, compassion, understanding, and every other virtue that can be weaponized to ensure you remain weak. You must recognize these protests for what they are. The death throes of a part of yourself that has kept you trapped in cycles of disrespect for years or decades. Part 2. The systematic destruction of weakness. The process of destroying the weak self is not a journey of becoming something new, but rather a systematic elimination of everything that prevents your natural dignity from manifesting. You do not need to build strength. Strength is your natural state. What you need to do is remove the learned behaviors, conditioned responses, and psychological patterns that suppress your inherent sovereignty. Start with silence. The weak self fills silence with words, explanations, justifications, and nervous chatter. It cannot tolerate the weight of another person's judgment or the tension of an unresolved moment. When someone says something disrespectful, the weak self rushes to respond, to smooth things over, to restore harmony at any cost. The strong self, the self that emerges when weakness is destroyed, knows that silence is a weapon. When someone disrespects you, pause. Let the weight of their transgression hang in the air. Let them feel the full impact of what they have done. Do not rescue them from the awkwardness they have created. This pause accomplishes several things simultaneously. It signals that their behavior has registered as unacceptable. It forces them to sit with the consequences of their action. And it prevents you from the weak self's reflexive responses of laughing, explaining, or apologizing. In this silence, something crucial happens. The other person's unconscious assessment mechanism, the one that is constantly evaluating boundaries and hierarchies, receives unmistakable data. It learns that disrespecting you creates discomfort for the transgressor, not for you. This is the essence of Machiavellian power, making the cost of transgression immediate and visceral. Not through angry outbursts or dramatic confrontations, but through the simple refusal to absorb disrespect without consequence. After the pause, if response is necessary, make it surgical. The weak self launches into lengthy explanations about why the behavior was unacceptable, how it made you feel, and what you expect going forward. This transforms you into a supplicant seeking understanding. The strong self states reality simply and moves on. That doesn't work for me. I won't accept that. That's not happening. These statements are not arguments to be debated or positions to be defended. They are declarations of reality. Notice there is no explanation, no justification, no appeal to the other person's empathy or understanding. You are not seeking their agreement or approval. You are informing them of a fact. The weak self fears being perceived as rude or unreasonable, so it wraps every boundary in apologetic language and careful explanations. But this fear is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of social dynamics. People do not respect those who are most careful with their feelings. They respect those who are most clear about their boundaries. Clarity is kindness. Ambiguity is cruelty. When you clearly state what is and is not acceptable, you give people the information they need to interact with you successfully. When you cushion every boundary with apologies and explanations, you make people guess where the real lines are, inevitably leading to violations and conflict. Consider how this applies to time. Someone habitually arrives 20 minutes late to meetings with you. The weak self tolerates this while feeling increasingly resentful. It might even make passive-aggressive comments or jokes about the lateness, but these do nothing to change the pattern. The strong self addresses it once clearly. I've noticed you're consistently late to our meetings. Going forward, I'll wait 5 minutes and then leave. If you're not there, we'll reschedule. Then, crucially, you do exactly that. The next time they're late, you leave after 5 minutes. No angry texts, no explanations, no drama. You simply enforce the boundary you established. This is where most people fail. They set boundaries but don't enforce them, which is worse than having no boundaries at all. It teaches others that your boundaries are theatrical, that your words have no relationship to your actions, that you can be safely ignored. Machiavelli understood that princes who make threats they don't carry out are worse off than those who make no threats at all. Unenforced boundaries are invitations to further transgression because they demonstrate that you are not serious, that your dignity is negotiable, that your weak self remains in control. The systematic destruction of weakness requires you to become consistent in your enforcement. This means every transgression receives a response, every time, with no exceptions. The weak self loves exceptions. It creates elaborate frameworks for when enforcement is appropriate and when it should be overlooked. They were stressed. It's not a big deal. I don't want to make a scene. Each exception is a message to your own mind and to the other person that your boundaries are optional. The strong self understands that consistency is everything. The boundary exists or it doesn't. The behavior is acceptable or it isn't. There is no middle ground, no situational ethics, no special circumstances. This does not mean treating every violation with the same intensity of response. Proportionality matters. Someone who accidentally interrupts you requires a different response than someone who consistently dismisses your contributions. But both require response. The accidental interrupter gets a calm, "I wasn't finished," and a pause until they acknowledge it. The consistent transgressor gets removed from your time and attention until they demonstrate changed behavior. The key is that the response is immediate, clear, and non-negotiable. As you begin enforcing boundaries consistently, you will experience a phenomenon that feels like the world is pushing back against you. People who are accustomed to violating your boundaries will escalate their behavior when you start enforcing them. This is predictable and temporary. They are testing whether your new boundaries are real or just another phase that will pass if they apply enough pressure. The weak self, interpreting this escalation as evidence that enforcing boundaries makes things worse, wants to retreat. This is the critical moment. This is where most people abandon their transformation and return to familiar patterns of tolerance. This is where the weak self makes its last stand. You must understand what is happening in this moment. The escalation is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that you are doing something right. You are disrupting established patterns, and the other person's subconscious is fighting to restore the status quo where they could violate your boundaries without consequence. If you hold firm, if you continue enforcing your boundaries with calm consistency despite the escalation, something remarkable happens. The behavior stops, not gradually, not through negotiation or mutual understanding, but suddenly. The other person's subconscious completes its assessment, determines that the old patterns no longer work, and adjusts. This adjustment happens beneath conscious awareness, which is why people often can't articulate why they suddenly started treating you differently. They just know, at some level they can't explain, that the rules have changed. Some relationships will not survive your transformation. This is not a failure. It is a revelation. When you stop allowing disrespect, some people will exit your life and their departure reveals a crucial truth. They were never relating to you as a full person. They were relating to your weak self, to your availability for transgression, to their ability to violate your boundaries without consequence. When you destroy your weak self, you destroy the basis of these relationships. This can feel like loss, but it is actually liberation. You are removing people from your life whose presence was conditional on your weakness. Machiavelli observed that a prince must be willing to lose those allies who are only loyal when they can exploit him. A prince who tries to maintain every relationship regardless of its quality becomes controlled by those relationships. He cannot act decisively because every action might upset someone. He cannot enforce standards because someone might leave. He becomes a prisoner of his own need to be universally liked and accepted. The prince who is willing to lose exploitative relationships, who is willing to stand alone if necessary, becomes truly free to act in his own interest. The same principle applies to personal dignity. You must be willing to lose relationships that require your weakness to function. As you eliminate weak patterns, you may notice something unexpected. New people begin entering your life and existing relationships transform. When you stop broadcasting signals of weakness, you stop attracting people who are drawn to weakness. When you establish clear boundaries, you attract people who respect boundaries. When you demonstrate sovereignty over your own life, you attract others who value sovereignty. This is not magic or manifestation. It is simple cause and effect. Your presence in the world changes, and the world responds to who you actually are rather than who you were pretending to be. The destruction of the weak self also requires examining your internal dialogue. The weak self maintains its existence through constant narration and justification. It tells you stories about why you need to tolerate disrespect, why enforcing boundaries would be cruel, why you should give people chances. These stories feel compassionate and mature, but they are mechanisms of self-betrayal. True compassion does not require you to accept mistreatment. True maturity does not mean tolerating boundary violations. True wisdom does not involve sacrificing your dignity to maintain false peace. Replace the weak self's narratives with simple, clear truths. I don't accept disrespect. My time has value. My boundaries exist for good reason. I am not responsible for others' reactions to my boundaries. People will treat me how I teach them to treat me. These are not affirmations to be repeated mechanically. They are truths to be embodied through action. Every time you enforce a boundary, you reinforce these truths. Every time you let a transgression slide, you reinforce the old narratives of weakness. The physical dimension of this transformation cannot be ignored. The weak self lives in your body as tension, collapsed posture, and hesitant movement. As you destroy these patterns mentally and behaviorally, you must also eliminate them physically. Stand with your full height, occupy space without apology. Move with purpose rather than hesitation. Speak at a volume that fills the room rather than asking for permission to be heard. These physical changes are not superficial. They are both cause and effect of internal transformation. Your body and mind are not separate systems. They are one system expressing itself through different channels. Practice the physical embodiment of non-negotiable boundaries. When someone approaches you with a request or demand, notice your body's first response. Does it lean forward eagerly? Does it tense up defensively? Does it begin the small movements of compliance before you've even decided? Train yourself to remain still, grounded, centered. Take a breath before responding. Let your body communicate that you are considering the request from a position of sovereignty, not from a position of automatic compliance or anxious appeasement. Part 3. The life of unshakable command. Once the weak self has been systematically destroyed, you enter a state that seems almost miraculous to those who have never experienced it. You become functionally immune to disrespect. This is not because people stop attempting to disrespect you, though such attempts do decrease dramatically, but because disrespect can no longer land. It slides off your sovereignty like rain off stone. You have eliminated the internal mechanisms that allow disrespect to wound you, and without those mechanisms, disrespect becomes merely noise. This immunity is not hardness or callousness. You do not become cold or detached. If anything, you become more genuinely present because you are no longer preoccupied with managing others' perceptions or protecting your fragile ego. The weak self required constant vigilance because it was always under threat. The strong self, the self that emerges when weakness is destroyed, requires no such vigilance because it has no vulnerable points. It does not depend on others' validation, fear their judgment, or need their approval. It simply exists, solid and self-sufficient. Machiavelli noted that the most secure princes were those whose power did not depend on the continued approval of others. A prince who rules through love can be destroyed when that love fades. A prince who rules through fear alone can be destroyed by those who overcome their fear. But a prince who rules through demonstrated capability and the consistent enforcement of reality becomes untouchable. His power is not based on others' feelings, but on the observed fact that crossing him carries immediate consequences, while cooperating with him carries benefits. People relate to such a prince not out of love or fear, but out of recognition of reality. When you live with unshakable command, you develop what can only be described as a natural authority. This authority does not come from position, credentials, or aggressive assertion. It emerges naturally from the total absence of weakness. People sense, without conscious awareness, that you are not available for the usual games of social manipulation. They sense that you will not be guilted, pressured, or cajoled into betraying your own interests. They sense that violating your boundaries will result in swift and certain consequences. And so, almost magically, they stop violating your boundaries. This does not mean conflict disappears from your life. It means that conflict becomes clean and purposeful, rather than messy and draining. When someone crosses a boundary, you address it immediately and move on. There is no rumination, no resentment, no passive-aggressive punishment. You simply enforce the consequence you established and return to equilibrium. The person either adjusts their behavior or removes themselves from your life. Either way, the problem is resolved quickly and decisively. The energy you previously spent managing disrespect, recovering from boundary violations, and tolerating indignities becomes available for productive purposes. This energy is substantial. Most people have no idea how much of their daily energy is consumed by the weak self's constant crisis management. When that drain stops, you suddenly have resources for creativity, ambition, and genuine connection. You can focus on what you want to build rather than what you need to defend. In professional contexts, this transformation is particularly powerful. The person who will tolerate disrespect in meetings, accept credit theft, work unpaid overtime, and absorb abuse from clients is the person who remains stuck regardless of their competence. The person who calmly and consistently enforces professional boundaries, who will walk out of a disrespectful meeting, who will document and report credit theft, who leaves on time regardless of pressure, who fires abusive clients, rapidly advances, not because they are ruthless or difficult, but because they have made it clear through action that their dignity is not for sale. People often mistake this for aggression or difficult behavior, but observe closely. The person with true command is usually calmer and more pleasant than those around them. They don't need to posture or threaten because their boundaries are real. They don't need to prove anything because their actions speak clearly. They can be generous, kind, and helpful because these behaviors are choices made from strength rather than obligations extracted by guilt. When kindness comes from sovereignty rather than weakness, it has entirely different quality and impact. You will notice that people begin seeking your respect and approval rather than you seeking theirs. This is the natural consequence of demonstrating that you are not available to be impressed or manipulated. When someone cannot get a reaction through disrespect, they unconsciously shift strategies. They begin trying to earn your regard through competence, respect, and genuine value. Your relationships become cleaner, more honest, and more reciprocal because you have eliminated the possibility of one-sided exploitation. The Machiavellian understanding of respect is fundamentally different from conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom suggests that respect is earned through achievement, granted through kindness, or commanded through force. Machiavelli understood that respect is the natural response to demonstrated self-command. People respect those who respect themselves, not in the sense of self-esteem or positive self-talk, but in the sense of consistently enforcing their own boundaries and protecting their own dignity. This respect is not given consciously or willingly. It is extracted automatically by the witnessed fact that you are not available for disrespect. Consider how this applies to verbal interactions. The person without command engages in long debates, gets drawn into justifying their positions, and becomes emotionally activated by disagreement. The person with command states their position once and then either acts on it or disengages. They do not need to convince anyone because they are not seeking permission. They do not need to win arguments because they have already made their decision. If someone wants to argue, that person can argue with themselves. You have already moved on. This principle extends to how you handle criticism. The weak self becomes defensive, explains itself, or absorbs the criticism as truth regardless of its validity. The person with command evaluates criticism based on its source and merit, accepts what is useful, discards what is not, and feels no need to justify this process to the critic. Thank you for your feedback becomes a complete response. Whether you actually thank them or implement their feedback is entirely your choice and none of their concern. You also develop the ability to end conversations and interactions unilaterally. The weak self feels trapped in interactions, unable to leave without permission or a socially acceptable excuse. The person with command simply ends things when they are done. I'm going to head out. This conversation isn't productive, so I'm ending it. I'm done discussing this. No elaborate excuses, no apologetic explanations, no permission requested. You are the sovereign of your own time and attention. You can grant these to others or withdraw them as you see fit. This creates a paradoxical effect. As you become less available and less tolerant of boundary violations, people value your time and attention more highly. The person who is always available is never valued. The person who protects their time and attention rigorously finds that others treat interactions with them as privileges rather than rights. You become selective about where you invest your limited resources, and that selectivity creates value. In intimate relationships, this transformation is particularly crucial. The weak self believes that love requires tolerance of disrespect, that commitment means accepting mistreatment, that loyalty involves sacrificing dignity. This belief creates relationships built on exploitation and resentment. When you destroy your weak self, you create the possibility for genuine intimacy based on mutual respect. You can be vulnerable without being weak, open without being exploited, loving without being diminished. A partner who truly loves you will respond positively to your boundaries. They will appreciate the clarity, respect the standards, and rise to meet them. A partner who requires your weakness to feel comfortable is not a partner worth having. This applies to friends, family members, and all other intimate connections. The people who belong in your life are those who relate to your strength, not those who are invested in your weakness. You may find that family dynamics, often the most resistant to change, begin to shift. Family members who have violated your boundaries for decades will test your transformation vigorously. They have the most invested in maintaining old patterns because those patterns have served them well. Hold firm. The discomfort of enforcing boundaries with family is temporary. The dignity you reclaim is permanent. Family relationships that survive this transformation become deeper and more authentic. Those that don't survive were never real relationships. They were exploitation disguised as connection. Living with unshakable command means accepting that you will sometimes stand alone. There will be moments when everyone around you thinks you're wrong, when your boundaries seem unreasonable to observers, when enforcing consequences appears harsh. In these moments, the weak self will whisper that you should compromise, that you're being too rigid, that you're damaging relationships. These whispers are lies. They are the ghost of your weak self making its final attempts to regain control. Machiavelli would tell you that the prince who tries to please everyone ends up pleasing no one and losing everything. The prince who is willing to stand alone when necessary, who enforces his will regardless of popularity, who values his own judgment above consensus, this prince survives and thrives. Your life is not a democracy where others get votes on your dignity. It is a principality where you are the sole authority on what you will and will not accept. As this way of being becomes natural, you stop thinking about respect and boundaries consciously. They become as automatic as breathing. You don't decide to enforce a boundary, you simply do it the moment it's crossed. You don't contemplate whether disrespect deserves a response. The response flows naturally from your established way of being. The vigilance required at the beginning relaxes into effortless command. You have destroyed your weak self so thoroughly that strength is now your default state. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing in him for their disrespect to grip. He has eliminated all the handholds that allowed others to pull him down. He has closed all the gaps through which disrespect could enter. He has become smooth, solid, and impermeable to the manipulations that work on everyone else. Not through aggression or hostility, but through the simple, consistent enforcement of his own sovereignty. This is the ultimate Machiavellian insight. Power is not something you take from others. It is something you stop giving away. Respect is not something you demand from others. It is something you stop violating in yourself. Every moment you tolerate disrespect, you are disrespecting yourself more thoroughly than anyone else could. Every boundary you fail to enforce, you are teaching the world that your dignity has no value. Every time you allow your weak self to control your responses, you are participating in your own diminishment. The transformation from weakness to strength is not a journey of becoming someone else. It is a return to who you were before the world taught you to be small. Children naturally enforce their boundaries until they are conditioned out of it. Watch a toddler respond to injustice. There is no hesitation, no self-doubt, no worry about being liked. There is only immediate, clear rejection of what is unacceptable. You are not building something new. You are excavating something ancient and true that was buried under years of conditioning. This excavation is the work of a lifetime, not because it is difficult, but because the weak self is clever and persistent. It will find new ways to justify weakness, new situations where boundaries seem inappropriate, new relationships where dignity seems negotiable. You must remain vigilant not through constant effort, but through consistent practice. Each boundary enforced makes the next one easier. Each consequence delivered makes the next one more natural. Each moment of standing firm erodes the weak self's power until it finally dissolves completely. In the end, the ultimate form of power is not the ability to control others, but the ability to be completely immune to their attempts to control you. The ultimate form of respect is not others' approval, but your own unwillingness to violate your own standards regardless of external pressure. The ultimate form of strength is not the capacity to dominate, but the capacity to remain sovereign no matter what forces surround you. Machiavelli wrote about princes, but his wisdom applies to every individual who must navigate a world of competing interests and inevitable conflict. You are the prince of your own life. Your dignity is your principality. The weak self is the internal traitor that opens the gates to invaders. Destroy it completely, and you become unassailable. Not because you are aggressive or defensive, but because you have eliminated everything in yourself that invited assault. This is not a call to become harsh or closed. It is a call to become real. The weak self is a performance, a mask, a strategy that doesn't work. The strong self is simply your natural state without the accumulated layers of learned helplessness and conditioned submission. When you destroy your weak self, you do not become less human. You become more human. You become present, authentic, and genuinely available for real connection, because you are no longer preoccupied with protecting your fragile boundaries. The world needs people who have destroyed their weak selves, not because such people are dominant or aggressive, but because they cannot be manipulated, exploited, or controlled. They form the backbone of any healthy system because they refuse to participate in the small corruptions and compromises that rot institutions from within. They can say no without guilt, yes without resentment, and hold standards without apology. Your life transforms when you make this shift, not because external circumstances change dramatically, but because your relationship to those circumstances changes completely. You stop being a victim of other people's behavior and become the author of your own responses. You stop hoping people will spontaneously respect you and start making respect the only viable option. You stop tolerating the intolerable and discover that most of what you thought you had to accept was optional all along. This is the path Machiavelli illuminated, though few have recognized its personal application. The prince was not just about ruling states, it was about ruling yourself. The man who cannot rule himself will be ruled by others. The man who has not destroyed his weak self will be destroyed by it. But the man who has eliminated every trace of weakness, who has made his dignity non-negotiable, who enforces his boundaries with the consistency of natural law, this man becomes immune to disrespect not because he is strong, but because there is nothing weak left in him to attack. Stand firm in this truth. Let it reshape every interaction. Let it inform every decision. Let it guide every response to disrespect. And watch as the world, unable to find purchase on your weakness, slowly but inevitably begins treating you with the respect that was always your birthright but that you must claim through action. The journey is not easy, but it is simple. Destroy your weak self. Enforce your boundaries. Accept the consequences. And discover that the man who cannot be diminished by himself can never be diminished by others.